This is Wayne Eberly. This is for our Sunday service on August 2nd. And it's the story where Jesus is surrounded by a crowd of people and they realize there's nothing to eat. In Matthew chapter 14, the crowd brings to him 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Well, bring them here to me, Jesus said. He directed the people to sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks. And then he broke the loaves. He gave them to the disciples. The disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number that ate that day were 5,000, along with the women and the children. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. That was the best meal I ever ate. Those words have been running through my mind as I think about the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Don't you think when all the feasting was finished, when the to-go containers were packed, when all the leftovers had been distributed, the crumbs swept away, don't you think that crowd, numbered at 5,000 plus, a crowd that included the 12 disciples, don't you think when they all went home that day that they were all nodding their head in agreement saying, that was the best meal I ever ate? Everything about the repast they shared in that remote place lent itself to saying, best meal ever. Jesus snuck away with his disciples to a remote place. But word got out, a crowd came. When Jesus saw the crowd, he was filled with compassion for them. He healed them till late in the day. And then the weary disciples came and said, it's time to send the crowd away. Send them to the villages to get something to eat. That's not what Jesus wanted to do, though. He wanted to see if they could feed that crowd themselves. And to say that the expectations of the disciples were low that day, that's not quite accurate. It's not that they had low expectations. They had no expectations. They didn't see how it could happen. And the crowd with their tummies grumbling took a survey. Well, what do we have? And out of the thousands of people, 2 little fish and 5 loaves. I think everyone probably agreed no meal was going to take place that day. It just ain't going to happen. But then, Jesus gives a mandate. Bring me those loaves and those 2 little fish. Jesus gives a mandate, and then Jesus begins to create. We don't know how. But Jesus begins to create. And all of a sudden, the hopes of the crowd elevate. As they see the food multiply, they begin to salivate. When Jesus finally called out, come and get it, there was no time to hesitate. When the feasting was done, they all agreed, boy, he sure does know how to satiate. And by the time all was said and done, everyone agreed, that was the best meal I ever ate. That was the best meal I ever ate. A friend of mine in Houston walked up to me after a church supper. Oh, he was patting his tummy with a satisfied look. He said, Wayne, that was the best meal I ever ate. A few weeks later, we had another church supper. After supper, patting his tummy with a satisfied look, he came up to me and said, Wayne, that was the best meal I ever ate. I looked at him to be sure he said what he had just said, and I had heard him right. I shrugged my shoulders. Not more than a month later, same man, same person, came up to me patting that same tummy. He looked at me and said, Wayne, and he said the same thing he had said 2 other times. He said, Wayne, that was the best meal I ever ate. Thankfully, his wife was walking up right behind him. She saw the look on my face, and she stepped in to clarify what was fast becoming a confusing situation. She said, oh, Don't bother him. His last meal is always his best meal. I nodded my head. Now I understood. Whatever meal he had just consumed, his last meal was his best meal. Reading about surely what must have been the best meal ever in the Bible, feeding 5,000 people, I'm starting to think like my good friend who would pat his tummy and say with satisfaction, that was the best meal I ever ate. Today I'm saying it as I still smell the fried fish and the freshly baked bread. It's lingering in the air. But not too long ago, I was hanging out at the home of Matthew the tax collector. He had invited Jesus over for a meal, and when Jesus was seated at table, Matthew whistled, called his friends. In no time at all, Matthew's house was teeming with tax collectors and sinners, and Jesus was sitting right in the middle of it, grubbing on some fried chicken and potato salad, grinning from ear to ear. You lick your fingers after a delicious meal like that, and you know what you say? That was the best meal I ever ate. Although there was that time when Isaiah the prophet talked about giving out the finest food for free. Chapter 55. Come, all who are thirsty. Come to the waters, and you with no money. You come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend your money on what bread and labor that doesn't satisfy? Listen to me and eat what is good. Your soul will delight in the richest fare. Wine, milk, the richest fare, and food that delights the soul. Sit down at that table, and I guarantee you'll be saying, that was the best meal I ever ate. On the other hand, there was that day 4 lepers stumbled upon a bountiful banquet. Back in the days of the prophet Elisha, when the capital city of Israel, the northern kingdom, was Samaria, that capital city was under siege. Under siege, a famine ensued. The situation was so bleak that 4 lepers, starving inside the city gates, made a decision. We're going to leave the safety of the city walls and go to our enemies. They're attacking us, but what do we have to lose? We'll say, if they spare us, we live. If they kill us, we die. Resigned, they set out to face their fate. But as they were leaving the city walls, the enemy was scared away. The enemy left their entire encampment unprotected. The lepers from Samaria, they stumbled upon the enemy camp, laden with treasures of silver and gold, and on that day, more importantly, filled with good food and fine drink. They ate, they drank, they carried away the silver, the gold, and clothes, and lugging all that treasure after their bountiful feast. You know what they said, don't you? That was the best. Surprisingly, that's not what they said. What they said that day is, we're not doing the right thing. This is a day of good news, and we're keeping it all to ourselves. Those lepers went back into Samaria. They hollered to get everyone's attention. All the starving citizens followed them out. Everyone ate. Everyone ate. Everyone ate and was satisfied. Then those 4 lepers said, that was the best meal I ever ate. They knew it wasn't right to keep it to themselves, but sharing the feast with others. Best meal ever. However, if we're going to talk about the time of Elisha, it's only fair to talk about his mentor, Elijah. Elisha had 4 lepers who were fed, but Elijah found one widow and her son. The widow was facing hard times. Elijah asked her, would you bring me a piece of bread? That's not asking too much, is it, a piece of bread? But the widow said, I don't have any bread. I've got a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home. I'm going to make a meal for myself and my son. We're going to eat it, and then we'll die." The prophet heard her sad tale, and he intervened. When the woman obeyed the prophet and brought him bread, her little store of flour and that tiny jug of oil started to miraculously multiply. And we are told that the jar of flour was never used up, and the oil never ran dry. Day after day after day, the miracle unfolded. And I just know that every day they said to themselves, "That was the best meal ever." And yet, speaking of bread that miraculously appeared day after day, the manna the Israelites gathered from the desert floor in the wilderness, that daily bread, I hope to goodness those Israelites said every day, that was the best meal ever. And still, now that we're getting back to Exodus, how about that night Israel ate a hurried meal? That night that their hearts raced with anticipation, God had told them, "Eat meat roasted over a fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast." That meal became known as the Passover. The Lord passed over all the houses of the Israelites. The door frames of their houses had been covered with blood, marking them for safety and salvation. They ate the meal with their cloaks tucked into their belts, sandals on their feet, staff in hand, and they ate it hurriedly. They ate with haste. They were in a hurry. That night, the Lord set them free from those centuries of slavery. They were on their way to the promised land. Roasted meat, bitter herbs, bread without yeast. That was the best meal ever. On the topic of Egypt, though, what do you think it was like when Joseph sat at table with his brothers? His brothers had thrown him into a pit, sold him into slavery in Egypt. Now those brothers were in Egypt, bowing down before Joseph, begging for bread. Nobody tells us what was on the menu that night, but when Joseph served a heaping course of forgiveness, followed by a hug fest, complete with an extra helping of joyful tears, my guess is 12 reconciled and reunited brothers all went to bed, patting their tummies, saying, "That was the best meal ever." Well, maybe a woman would come forth and say, "No, let me tell you about the best meal ever." Her name is Sarah. Sarah's husband was Abraham, the father of our faith, the father of Israel. All these stories we've been hearing today have a Jewish heritage, including the stories of Jesus. Listening to all the talk about the best meal ever, Sarah decided to make her case. "I was sitting in the tent one hot day when my husband burst in. Some visitors had arrived, and true to form, Abraham knew we had to show hospitality to the strangers. 'Quick,' he said, 'get a measure of fine flour, knead it, and bake some bread.' Then he ran to the herd. He selected a choice tender calf, gave it to the servant to prepare. He then brought curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared, the bread I made, and he served our 3 visitors. They ate outside the tent. I was nibbling inside while they talked together. There was nothing unusual about the meal. It was ordinary fare. But as those visitors made conversation, those strangers said the strangest thing. They told Abraham they'd come back in a year, and I would have delivered a baby. I forgot to tell you, by this time in my life, I was very, very old, long past the age of giving birth. They told their strange story, and I couldn't help it. I laughed. It was outrageous. Me having a baby? Well, a year later, a son was born to us in our old age. We named him Isaac, which means laughter. I mean to tell you, I look back at that day when those strangers stopped and I baked some bread for them, and I will always say, that was the best meal ever. All of these best meals. Who is right? How do you judge? Who is right? Everybody. Who is wrong? Nobody. Time and time again, when the people of God are fed by the hand of God, they are right in saying, that was the best meal I ever ate. Like my friend at his church suppers, the best meal I ever ate is the last meal I ate. And today, the last meal I ate was the feeding of the 5,000. Today, that was the best meal I ever ate. But goodness, if we can look back at the feeding of the 5,000 and back to the history, couldn't we also look forward to that day the prodigal son came home and the father prepared the fattened calf with tears of joy and a hug for the ages as they took that last bite of butchered beef? A joyful father and a forgiven son, they wiped their mouths and they said, that was the best meal I ever ate. Or Peter and Cornelius, a Jew and a Gentile, sitting down together in a house filled with the Holy Spirit. The power of the Lord was present. They were speaking in tongues. They had an impromptu baptism service. Now a Jew and a Gentile were brothers in faith. What do you think they said about that meal? Best meal I ever ate. I heard my friend say it so many times I just shook my head. At the time I couldn't understand. That was the best meal I ever ate, until his wife said his last meal was his best meal. Well, maybe that's how I want to finish my sermon today. The last meal, it is the best meal. And by the last meal, I'm talking about his last meal. I'm talking about the last meal Jesus had with his disciples. We call it the Last Supper. On the night he was betrayed, Jesus took bread. He gave thanks, and he broke the bread, saying, this is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Then he took the cup. He poured it out, saying, this cup is the cup of forgiveness. It's sealed in my blood. Do this in remembrance of me. As hard as it is for us to swallow that the Son of God had to die for us, in hindsight, don't we all want to say, that was the best meal ever? And in this case, it was the last meal, the Last Supper. But to say that the Last Supper was the best meal, it doesn't knock all these other meals down a notch or make them second rate or overshadow them. I think what the Last Supper shows us is it was the best of the best. Like the tax collector and his friends, Jesus invites all the sinners to come to his table. Like Isaiah, Jesus prepares the finest meal and the best wine, and he says, come enjoy the richest fare, and it's all given for free. Like Elijah and the widow with her unending supply of flour, there is an endless supply of grace at this table. Like the manna, the bread is from heaven. Like the Passover, there is a lamb that is sacrificed, and there is blood that covers the door frames of our hearts. And we eat the meal with anticipation. We are going to be set free from the chains of sin and the cords of death. Like Joseph and his brothers, this table is all about reconciliation and restoration. Like the prodigal son, there are tears and hugs as the ones who are lost are found. Like Sarah and Abraham, our tent is filled with laughter at the outrageous promise of God, an outrageous promise that miraculously comes true. Like Peter and Cornelius, this table includes all. People will come from the east, from the west, from the north and the south to sit at this table. Like those 4 lepers in the time of Elisha, this is good news we can't keep to ourselves. We tell others. And like the 5,000 he fed, there are leftovers. So much grace it can't be consumed. Our cup runneth over. Best meal ever? I guess I'd have to say any meal with Jesus. But then again, I'd have to say every meal with Jesus is the best meal ever. Come and dine, the Master calleth. Come and dine. He who fed the multitude and turned the water into wine. Come and dine, the Master calleth. Come and dine. Amen.